Science Cinema, and for the second day of our Slow Cinema weekend. I hope many of you made it to the Fred Kellerman screenings last night. So I'm really, really delighted to welcome our panellists. We have Jonathan Romney, the film critic, Ben Rivers, filmmaker, who's showing his films this weekend, Saturday and Sunday morning. George Clark, who's a curator and programmer, who is responsible for curating the Lav Diaz programmes with the festival. We have Lav Diaz, who we're delighted to bring to the UK for the first time. He arrived from Manila yesterday, so he's drinking coffee now. Hopefully you'll stay with us.
Don't worry.
And Matthew Flanagan, who is actually undertaking a PhD which is nearly finished on slow cinema, and is also the editor of a really fantastic online journal called Lumen. And I think in your information packs there's an article from Lumen, which is an In Conversation event with Lav. So there's lots of kind of interesting connections between our panellists, and people have written about some of the filmmakers. So we're kind of very interconnected. So I'm hoping that there'll be a flow across the discussion. I wanted to kind of start off by just explaining a little bit about the reason why we're looking at the term slow cinema within the festival. As many of you have probably gathered, AV Festival isn't a normal film festival in that respect. We're a cross-art form festival working across music, visual art and film, and the festival is stretched to be a month long in duration. So the concept of slow cinema is very much situated for me within the wider festival and within the expanded sense of us having exhibitions across the region as well, although this weekend we are largely in cinema spaces. And the festival was really a response to the kind of accelerated pace of technology today in one respect. It was a bit of a response to the Cultural Olympiad and what do we mean by cultural consumption today, where should investment lie? And really it was a bit of a plea for audiences themselves to slow down. I think festivals are really fascinating because for me festivals are this rupture into everyday life, and a month-long festival just gave us the opportunity to really extend that and to provide space for artists to present work that's not normally seen, but for audiences to see work which isn't normally presented. And I think one of the things we may touch on in the panel is really how people can experience work which is either slow in pace or long in duration, because most film festivals are very much about you getting from A to B in the quickest way possible. And I know definitely when we talk about Lav's work, often people don't experience, he regularly shows his work at festivals like Rotterdam once a year, but how does one experience a 6 or an 8 hour film within a film festival context? So really AV Festival is trying to provide a space for a different type of audience experience. As many of you are probably aware, the term slow cinema is itself controversial, and I didn't really want to sort of celebrate the term or really talk about it as a movement. So that's probably one of the first things we're going to talk about. Really, it's kind of more important for me personally that we talk about the artist's work and look at the different temporalities that artists are exploring. But we do have this term, slow cinema, which there's a couple of articles in your pack. One is by Dan Fox from Freeze, and I think Dan just makes a really valuable contribution by just illustrating that slow cinema isn't a new movement. It's not something which is solely associated with the phenomena of film festivals over the last decade. It's something which has its origins largely in artist film, key works being things like Michael Snow's Wavelength, which is a film to experience temporally within the cinema space, and Warhol, etc. But I guess the starting point in a way kind of feels like it has to be the recent debate that occurred in April 2010 in Sight and Sound. So we'll start there. And it started with Jonathan Romney's kind of article, in Sight and Sound, and I'll just quote you if you don't mind. The quote that's appeared has been re-quoted absolutely everywhere, and we can actually get to the bottom of what the quote actually means now we have Jonathan with us, is Romney has described slow cinema as a varied strain of austere minimalist cinema that has thrived internationally over the past 10 years, a cinema that downplays event in favour of mood, evocativeness and an intensified sense of temporality. And really that article then sort of spiralled a little bit of a backlash. There was an editorial which you may be aware of in Sight and Sound the following month, in which Nick James, the two main points that Nick James was mentioning was, I think one of the most controversial things Nick James said was that he felt that there was maybe a laziness and an easy life for critics and programmers to show this kind of slow work at film festivals, and that such films are easy to remember and discuss in detail because details are few. And this is an interesting issue because for those of us who enjoy watching films, whatever we want to label them as, the very essence of them having few details and be able to actually absorb yourself in the film doesn't actually mean that therefore there are few details. Actually, in many respects, minimalism in both music and film actually means that there are hundreds of details, but they're just communicated in an unconventional and a non-narrative way. So I wanted to definitely talk about that as well. So maybe we'll start with that, and given that we've just outlined that starting point with the sight and sound debate. And I guess I was interested in actually everybody's contributions to just, I don't want to go round and round in circles about definitions, but I think it'd be really useful to just start off by talking about what you understand as being slow cinema and its core characteristics and, you know, the main issues for you, starting this way.
Yeah, sure. The whole thing about slow cinema being a phenomenon of the last 10 years, well, obviously it's not. I mean, I just think that we've become very aware of it over the last 10 years. We've become very aware because mainstream cinema in all its manifestations is getting faster and more corporate and more disposable. When I started writing about film, it was in the 80s, and actually I was writing mainly about Hollywood or about smaller budget American films, and realising that, you know, within genre cinema it was an incredibly exciting time. You could write about the mainstream, you could write about films that seemed to be representing the kind of, you know, the psyche of the mainstream cinema world, and there was a lot of incredibly interesting stuff going on. It was very revealing cinema. I haven't found anything like the same pleasures in the mainstream for years. I keep hoping that, you know, I'm going to see a mainstream film that kind of hits the button in the way that, you know, like, I don't know, The Terminator did in the 80s, or, you know, some of those guy who made The Last Seduction. Anyway, his films, you know, people who, and that sort of strain of people working, you know, the kind of reworking film noir and the whole kind of Jim Thompson world. There was a lot of very, very interesting stuff going on. But I've just not found the same kind of pleasure, and I feel a lot of people probably feel the same way, in writing about mainstream cinema now, or watching mainstream cinema. And it's as a result of this that I think people at festivals particularly, because that's the first chance you have to see these films, are turning to a more contemplative cinema, which is not new by any means, because I wrote about Fred Kellerman, Bela Tarr, various other people in sort of the mid to late 90s. I was aware that they'd been around a while. I was aware that I was catching up with them late. This Freeze piece kind of points out that filmmakers like Matthew Barney, or a filmmaker artist Matthew Barney, are left out of this equation. But, you know, I got very interested in his Cremaster cycle in the mid-90s, and, you know, it seems to me a very different thing entirely. I mean, I wouldn't associate him with filmmakers like Bela Tarr or Kellerman or Alessandro Alonso or Tsai Ming Liang or any of those people. It seems a completely different aesthetic. But clearly, yes, slowness has been with us for a very long time, going back to Warhol's Empire State, going back to Antonioni. And it's something that I think you have to learn. I mean, you know, you can't say this is the sort of good, worthy, high-minded cinema that we should all be watching and that we should all be sensitive to, rather than, you know, this terrible fast consumed pablum that is being thrust at us. Because actually, it's a matter of sensibility, and this is not a sensibility that you can sort of instantly have or instantly be attuned to. I mean, I think some people, yes, probably will walk into Satan Tango and be bowled over because they've never seen anything like it before, and it'll be instantly, it'd be sort of love at first sight. My personal experience is that it took me a long time to sensitize myself to a different kind of pace. And it was in the late 70s, and I remember watching things like, I remember watching Antonioni then, I remember watching Tarkovsky. I remember having a really, really difficult time with Wender's Kings of the Road. I found it interminable. I felt I'd never seen a film that long, that slow. I didn't know what to do with it. And it was not because I was having sort of an endless diet of Hollywood action movies. I'm not even sure what I was watching then, but I think I had been watching, art cinema of one kind or another for several years. But that kind of attention, that kind of intensity of attention was a completely new thing for me. And I only really learned to watch that kind of cinema simply by watching a great deal of it, and in particular spending one summer, 2 weeks at the Cambridge Film Festival and watching 5 or 6 films by an Indian filmmaker, Mrinal Sen, which were probably the slowest things I'd seen at that time, and I didn't like them at the time particularly, but it was a degree of retuning. So the idea that advocates of slow cinema would be saying, this is the stuff you have to like because the other stuff is bad. I mean, that's complete nonsense. What the debate is, the storm that Nick James' editorial has started. I mean, there was a degree of scepticism at the time. I mean, I'd been asked to write a piece in the Sight and Sound issue that was looking back at the first 10 years of the millennium, and they asked me to write about slow cinema because it was something I'd written about before. I'm not even sure where the term came from, but the idea of it was that by analogy with the Italian slow food movement, that was a reaction to fast food. That was food that was prepared fast, digested fast, and you get a quick turnover in the restaurant, and you get the next people. The idea of slow food it was something that had to be made with great attention and grown with great attention and consumed with some degree of attention. It was about sort of bringing pleasure and a slow burning pleasure back to the equation. So that was certainly the idea behind my use of the term. That was the understanding. But I'd been talking to a number of friends and colleagues who'd been watching and really loving a lot of these films, but also finding that we didn't like everything, and we found that certain mannerisms were kind of beginning to repeat themselves and beginning to get under our skin in a certain way. And I was particularly sceptical about The Russian Ark, which I felt in a way was a novelty movie. Not in a bad way. It's a Sokurov film that I like most. I don't enjoy him that much at all, but this one I liked, but I felt you had to recognise that it was kind of a novelty movie in a way. It was a sort of, in a very, very elegant, sophisticated way, it was a kind of a stunt movie. But we were also aware that we'd seen a lot of people walking across Patagonia and walking back again, maybe one too many times. I like Lisandro Alonso's films a lot, but Liverpool, I felt, okay, I kind of know this terrain now, and I know how long the journey's going to take. I had misgivings about Birdsong by Albert Serra, in which the 3 characters walk very slowly across the landscape into a distance. There's a pause, and a few moments later they walk all the way back again. And I thought this had become, if there was ever the cliche of slow cinema, it had been created at that moment. I'd seen Vincent Gallo do exactly the same. Even Bel Attar does it in his new film. They disappear over the horizon, they come back. So really it was a way of talking about a kind of cinema I'm very passionate about, but not uniformly passionate, because, for example, I loved Simon Liang. Hu Xiaoshen bores me rigid. I don't know why. It's inexplicable. I think his films are sort of faster and livelier than Simon Liang's, but yet for me they're more boring. So it's the idea was important to say, well, yeah, you can be very committed to this aesthetic and to this experience, this mode of experiencing time, but you don't have to like everything. But it's interesting to think about why you might like certain filmmakers' work and not others. And what came up here, I mean, Nick's piece, I think, really kind of catalysed this whole argument, because there were a lot of very, very violent reactions online. But I think maybe he's making a rather unfortunate choice. I'm not sure if it was this article or another one. Yeah, here you go. It's the Berlin Golden Bear winner, Honey, the Turkish film, a beautifully crafted work that for me suffers from dwelling too much on the visual and oral qualities of its landscape and milieu. There are times as you watch someone trudge up yet another woodland path when you feel an implicit threat, admit you're bored and you're a Philistine. In a way, it was a very good choice, because it is a very, it's an example of how this style can become sort of mannered and atrophied. At the same time, it's a sort of very bad choice, because I think really this is a very, very minor film, and it's a very kind of, it's sort of like, the pop version of slow cinema. It's more like a very, very kind of etiolated version of the beautiful arts and rural art cinema of the 70s. It's like a Turkish version of sort of Taviani Brothers Light. So it's maybe not the film that one would necessarily choose to really crystallise, to mobilise a kind of a war of rhetoric around.
Which is one of the dangers, really, is that as soon as individual films start being used as representative of stereotypes within movements, it affects how you talk about other artists' work. And so I guess I was interested in Ben and Lav in particular, just in terms of how your work is seen and distributed, and how comfortable you are with terminologies like slow cinema. And also, obviously, you're at a lot of other international film festivals, so you've spent time in bars with Albert Serra and other filmmakers within this sort of genre. But interestingly, 2 Years at Sea is about to be distributed by Soda.
Mm-hmm.
So,
I mean, I can't remember ever having a conversation with another filmmaker about slow cinema.
yeah. Sorry.
Probably about the slow service in the bars.
Yeah, it's. I mean, really, I've never really thought of it. I've never really thought of my films as being particularly slow either. I think they're kind of there's quite a lot going on. I mean, it goes back to what you said at the beginning about someone's comment saying that there were less details to remember. Yeah. I totally agree with you that actually there's probably more details to remember, because the details in like a fast film, they tend to be just like explanatory. They're not really details that you can savor. I don't know. I feel like, well, 2 Years at Sea. I mean, there's some longueurs in it, but I feel like those longueurs, they're actually. I mean, my thinking behind them was that they were quite action-packed, because there's an expectation. Expectation of something happening is also another kind of. It's a different kind of excitement. Yeah. So it's you don't have to constantly feed people with actual pieces of information. You actually. I guess it's a way of allowing the audience to be more engaged. Actually, use their own brain and imagination. I mean, that seems like a pretty key thing in terms of the cinema that I want to make, but also the cinema that I've enjoyed, for a really long time, is cinema that has space for kind of engagement. And so I think more along those terms than in terms of like speed or length, which when it comes to speed and length, that it's not something that I'm really conscious. Like, this is, well, actually there was one shot where I was like, this has to be 10 minutes, but usually it's about it's about a feeling. It's about formally responding to the content. you know, like what is necessary to express this particular idea. It's not the other way around, where I want a 10-minute shot and I've got to find out how to fill it with a walk over a horizon and back again. You know, and I think the same with Albert. It's infuriating. It can be infuriating, but I personally think that shot is great. And it's dictated by that movement. It's not dictated by him wanting to annoy, you know, saying I've got a video camera so I can run it for 20 minutes. I think there's a real, you know, he's got a very definite idea of why he wants to watch three people, you know, walk 2 miles and then walk back again, and it kind of made sense to me.
It's actually a very funny shot also, because that film is a comedy, but it is the most slow burning comedy. But I think if you take it in a comic spirit, and it's like a very kind of laid back version of Beckett.
Yeah, I mean, there's a really obvious kind of connection with him and Beckett, and I think you know, like you said, you kind of do have to train yourself a bit for that. You have to work your way up, maybe, and I don't know, watch. I mean, it goes like I started watching Dreyer pretty early on. I would say that was quite a good grounding for me, because, you know, I started with Vampire and then you know, worked my way up to Gertrude, and Gertrude is pretty much, you could easily fit that into this category of slow cinema. I mean, it's unbelievably infuriating, but it's great. If you like, it took me like 3 or 4 times. I started watching it and I didn't get into it, but like when I eventually did watch it all the way through, it was so satisfying and rewarding. So I think it's, you know, sometimes you do have to kind of, it's, you know, it's a bit of training. Whereas you know, the kind of commercial cinema that we're all used to, you don't really need training for it, because it's very simple. I mean, that's why it's kind of nice sometimes, because you don't have to do anything. Obviously, that's why people like it.
But the other thing is, we have been trained by it. I mean, that's
Right.
the thing. It's like the commercial cinema, and this is something, you know, and the idea that a film should be 90 minutes. I mean, that's not something we talked about, Catherine, this morning, but that length was not derived at by filmmakers as, wow, this is actually the perfect length, this is how long all films should be. I mean, that was derived by exhibitors and the people who, you know, built structures to commercially exploit the potential of moving image and structure of cinema. And so we have been taught how to respond to certain durations. And there's this and also museums, you know, museums are part of that kind of educational project, and I think there's a broader question now about how, you know, cultural institutions, what their responsibility is to, you know, promoting different modes of viewership. So there's this kind of fascinating example from the cinema. One of the oldest relationships between a cinema and museum was the cinema department at MoMA in New York, the Museum of Modern Art, and they were one of the first institutions to really take cinema seriously. And to do that, they kind of started this project to kind of re-educate the audience about what it meant to watch a film in a serious manner. And so the curator of the film department actually sat at the back of the auditorium next to a slide projector, where she had a slide that was set up that when the crowd would get too noisy or too rowdy, they'd stop the projection and she'd show this slide that said, unless you quiet down, the film will not continue. You know, and so there's been, like, audiences have been trained, you know, by all different types of institutions, commercial and also kind of cultural, you know, alongside different times, different ideologies about what's the purpose or use of cinema. You know, and a lot of, like, the film society movement and kind of cultural cinema movement went alongside a whole sense of how cinema can be used to educate, to kind of improve, you know, kind of cinema social responsibility. You know, that then has also created these kind of certain conditions of spectatorship as well.
I mean, there's a huge amount there in terms of the politics of all of this, in terms of cinemas as institutions and also programmers' responsibility. And I guess Ben was starting to sort of touch on the freedom of filmmakers to make work within the time and space that you want to make them in. And I think if I may be misquoting you, Lav, but I think once you said something about, you know, my films aren't about duration, they're about freedom. So I guess there's something here about cinema that's produced in the margins or on the margins, and then how that's presented. So I wondered if you could say a few words about your work and duration and the process of making it. And
with my cinema, I'm trying to apply my praxis more on my culture, because I'm a Malay. I'm from the end of the world, you know, the southern island of the Philippines. I grew up in the middle of the forest. So we are more governed by space, a lot of space. The word, the Filipino word, the Malay word for time is panahon. Panahon means governed by space. So our concept of time is more of having all this space. And I grew up in a place where people are just waiting, sitting, making love, you know, fishing, farming. So I'm trying to apply that. My praxis is more on applying these things. It's my culture. And early on, because I grew up in a place where we're watching a lot of movies, because my father is a movie addict. We watch 8 movies a week, Hollywood, Hong Kong, all the profit-oriented movies in the Philippines. So when I grew up, and then when I discovered the likes of Antonioni, Tarkovsky eventually, I realized there's another way of doing cinema. So I might as well apply that, because I'm an artist, and I also know that cinema is still a very young art, so the horizon is still very vast. So, you know, we're exploring. Yeah.
I guess one of the things that we've been talking about most so far is the duration of work and audience response, and I guess that's why it's really crucial to have Ben and Lav on the panel, because I guess other issues around temporality are related to the actual production of work. And obviously I'm aware that one of your films was a 10-year journey in which kind of actors appeared and disappeared, and you went on that journey with a whole crew.
Yeah.
And I don't know whether you can explain just kind of emotionally, psychologically, politically, artistically what that
the film is called Evolution of a Filipino Family. We did that film for like 10 years, and when I started the film, I was working in New York. As a waiter, as a gasoline attendant. So I was earning for my family. I'm sending the money back home, and also I'm earning to buy one roll every week, which is $80. One roll of 16 millimeters, $80. So every time I can have like 3 cans of rolls, I ask my friends to shoot. So I started that way. So it took us 10 years to do that. So it's making films on the margins. So you see your actors growing up, you see your actors dying along the process. So yeah, it's 10 years. It's evolution of the family. I shot a lot of footage in Virginia, Maryland, and New York, and I thought that was the film. And then when I went back to the Philippines in 1997, I'm trying to do a flashback of the film. It's about the struggle by Filipino in New York. So when I went back to Manila, I started doing this flashback, and then it just became very organic. We were shooting from 1997 up to 2005, and it became the film. So the ones that I shot in New York, it's still there. I didn't put it in the film. It's another film.
I was going to say, because in terms of your process, you often maybe shoot footage and then maybe it reappears or is reshot in different films, and it's almost like this kind of entirely durational artistic process where you're constantly refeeding and reusing and looking at your footage and applying it in different ways.
It's very hard, because every time you have the money and the roles, and you started, studying the footage again, and then you try calling up people, are you still alive? Yeah, I'm still alive. How old are you now? can we meet and can I look at you if you're still okay? That's why along the process 2 actors died, so I have to rework on the script. I have to be doing all these things. So it worked anyway. It's an 11-hour film.
And in terms of the festival, you're working with George, and we've been having conversations about audience response and experience to your work, and the kind of discipline and preparation that the audience need to do to kind of experience.
A lot of festivals have their own way of showing my films. One festival showed it in four parts, and some festivals are very disciplined also to show it in one sitting, 11 hour. And those who follow my films, they are very prepared. They're warriors. They're formidable. They eat and they sleep well before the show. And after the show, we still have long discourse on the films, like 2 hours, 3 hours. It goes on and on. And just a few months ago, when I saw the film in Rotterdam, in January, some were angry because they thought I'm selling out. It's getting short. They said it's already 6 hours. They want longer films.
But it's interesting that space of watching kind of almost parallels the beautiful way that you described the cultural issues of time and space. So that actually you're almost generously then putting that within a cinema space and allowing a discussion to happen, which I think is really extraordinary. So everybody should sleep well tonight in preparation for Lav's 8-hour screening of Melancholia tomorrow. That we're
It's
already
9 hours.
excited
It's
about.
8 hours, no? 8 hours.
I was saying 8, but I don't know whether you've recut it in the last day.
This is going to be the director's cut running all week.
I'm kind of doing this thing of going down in a line. We're being very linear here, but I guess some of the stuff that George was just talking about in terms of institutional kind of behaviours and this kind of sense that how do you teach an audience, or how do people learn to have the confidence in themselves and to permit themselves to give themselves to watching work that's maybe long in duration or has different temporalities. I guess I was interested in talking to Matthew about that, because you've kind of looked, I guess, fairly historically, or you've definitely kind of talked about slow cinema from kind of roots in the 60s, Antonioni, etc. And I know you've been swamped with your PhD, but I wondered if you could give some reflections as to your sort of experience of the definition of the movement and where you see it coming from and where it is now.
In definitional terms, like it is very difficult to categorise this as a particular, like we can see a certain set of stylistic tendencies or devices that are being used and recycled, used over and over again. But in terms of characterising it as a genre or a movement, it's much more difficult. And I kind of have a couple of ways of very crude, very basic ways of thinking about it. If we are to historicise it in the broadest possible terms, I think one thing that we see or have seen, if we identify this as something which has become more common over the last 10 years or so, last decade or so, is sort of a kind of increasing convergence of two major historical traditions. Like on the one hand, you have, say, European art cinema after the Second World War, like both neorealism and the way that neorealism bleeds into Antonioni's films, and you have this emergent undramatic movement which are about how people live and the dead times within sort of people's lives. And then on the other hand, you have in the 60s, after Antonioni and kind of this European art cinema tradition, you have, say, American structural film. And then you have Warhol in the 60s and Michael Snow and so on, which introduce kind of, really sort of excessive duration into more experimental forms of cinema. And then these two things kind of, these two traditions sort of rumble on at the same time. European art cinema gets taken up by Tarkovsky and then say Angelopoulos and so on, and becomes more modernist. And at the same time, the kind of American structural tradition continues within strictly experimental film rather than narrative film. And say, so nowadays you'd have filmmakers like James Benning and Sharon Lockhart, which seem to embody that thing. But at the same time, you're seeing these two different traditions, if we can be so crude to lump them together, have kind of become increasingly convergent. And so we have sort of a new type of experimental art cinema, which seems to marry like the kind of major things which are being explored within those two traditions. And that's my very crude way of, if we are to kind of attempt to historicise it and categorise it as such. So I do have a quite a crude way of categorising slow cinema as such, which it has, there's sort of a basic schema in which there are three things, which like three boxes to be ticked effectively. There's the first one is that a slow film as such must have an undramatic narrative, like very simply like a sort of renunciation of what Raoul Ruiz called central conflict in films, like the main sort of driver of commercial film or classical cinema. The second one is the long take, so an unbroken representation of an event or a non-event or time before or after an event or a non-event. And then the other one is stillness, which would be either stillness in terms of a camera setup, in the fact that the camera is kept very, very still to focus its attention on a certain event, or either the information within the frame, what is being portrayed, is something which is very unspectacular, undramatic, so as to draw attention to say certain material details or whatever that would usually escape us, because you've kind of stilled the action, stilled the event, and you're able to focus your attention in a different way. That's my very crude, that only gets us so far. Like that's not something which, thankfully, very thankfully, the filmmakers don't have to worry about. That's the job, that's up to us to kind of worry about, categorising this stuff. But that's the crudest model I have, and I don't think you can go much further than that. Actually, then it gets interesting from that point on.
I mean, I guess for me, the big thing that's missing though is politics, right? And the big theorization, the kind of big part of where, I mean, Warhol is usually cast as an apolitical artist, but I think the influence of his work was taken up as a political practice. And in some ways, the way that his work travelled and was influenced other filmmakers was in a whole discourse about the politics of representation and a non-representational film practice that was kind of tied in with structuralism, that in some ways has been sort of historicised as like an aesthetic, apolitical movement. I think it's really important to remember that like a lot of history of experimental film came out of very like kind of political intention, and Duration itself was political work, and largely this is also inspired by theorisations around third cinema and ideas of kind of collective practice, decentralised practice, non-hierarchical practice. And so the other big exponents really of Duration as a political practice were the kind of film collectives that emerged in the late 60s. So Jean-Luc Godard's, like abandoning of the conventions of like a narrative feature to make works and collaborate with Jean-Pierre Gorin, and the kind of whole emergence of kind of political film groups, political movements, is tied into a debate around duration as an anti-illusionistic device. And I think what I find dissatisfying about kind of debate around slow cinema is that it kind of forgets about that politics, and also it's also, I think, for filmmakers like Kiarostami or like Pitchpong, they're very political filmmakers, and I think to forget the kind of context that they're coming from and kind of political context they're coming from is really to lose a lot of the I think that's kind of this kind of corrosive, or one of the sort of dangerous or corrosive functions of film festivals, and I think that's something that we should kind of fight against. The film festivals shouldn't be these kind of entities of erosion, that kind of create this kind of international sort of divorced discourse, but there should be spaces where there's room for kind of political discourse. And I think that's been my, looking at a lot of this cinema. My background comes more from the experimental practice and looking at legacies of kind of political filmmaking. I think for me, that's where this work kind of gets really interesting, and that's a lot of my thinking is like tied into kind of politics of representation.
And I think you're right that one of the dangers of festivals or any way of talking about slow cinema as a kind of a mass object is to level everything out, and in leveling it out somehow to to take the sting out of it by suggesting that it's some sort of rarefied, hyper-aesthetic, sort of quasi-spiritual experience, which, some of these films can be quasi-spiritual, but if they are, they're all quasi-spiritual in very specific ways, in Apichat Pong, coming from a Buddhist perspective and talking about how kind of that tradition of seeing the world merges, with the reality of contemporary Thailand and its relation to the rest of the world and to modernity. I think the really kind of dangerous thing is to to depict all proponents of slow cinema and all consumers of slow cinema as somehow, kind of late 19th century sort of exquisite dandies going into a sort of reverie and getting high on their own kind of aesthetic superiority of perception. It's not about that at all, and every film that we're talking about involves... I mean, why it's political is that all these films... do or at least should, but at any point I think with everyone the question comes up, all these films one way or another break down these very deeply entrenched habits of viewing, and these are habits that are industrially conditioned in us, so that when we go and see a rom-com, everything from the duration to the rhythm of the editing to the colour scheme. I don't know if you've ever noticed this, that sort of sitting on a plane, you can actually tell, if you look over the seat in front of you, you can actually tell within half a second what the genre of the film is that the person in front of you is watching, just from the colours alone. Try it next time, and it's alarming how easy it is. So all these very, very deeply entrenched, deeply conditioned habits of viewing, each time we watch one of these films that we're talking about, we have to, or we should be asking the question from scratch, and it's something that you force yourself to ask within the first minute of one of these films. How do I watch this? What are the new conditions of viewing that I have to... And now, if that's not a political question, I don't know what is. And particularly now, because I think the habits of watching films today is significantly different, even in the commercial arena, to what it was 10 years ago. I mean, now the idea of watching any film at all, going into a cinema for whether it be 90 minutes or 2 hours or 8 hours, the idea of going into a cinema and just watching a film and making that commitment to the film, which involves turning off your phone, not tweeting. I mean, it's all changed. Even at festivals, people are going in and just sort of kind of sitting there, sort of tweeting relentlessly, probably even through Lav's films,
Yeah.
Well, actually, I think some filmmakers would be very happy to have that response going on, but I think the idea of going to watch a film and really giving yourself up to, the direct dialogue with what's going on screen, and it really is a very active dialogue. That's certainly kind of a political action in some way, in the sense that it's kind of reacting against the kind of the fast consumption passivity of the Hollywood model, but at the same time it's also becoming in some ways like a kind of I suppose, if you like, it's like a kind of going into a sort of contemplative retreat. But certainly that's a political action in itself, in that for the duration of the film, you're choosing to withdraw from the process of, subscribing to, you know, the kind of the commerce of cinema, and you're committing yourself very, very actively and very energetically, and you know, in the case of Lav Cinema, you know, his which I haven't seen yet, but I really like this idea of viewers committing themselves, you know, like warriors. And, you know, there is a certain demand, you know, in seeing one of his films or in seeing a Bel Attar film. You say, okay, I'm going to take on this commitment rather than entertain me. And that certainly is kind of, in a very sort of small and you know, abstract way, it's kind of a political commitment of sorts.
Absolutely. I mean, one of the things that the New York Times article mentions is actually, let me find it. They actually said movies may be the only art form whose core audience is widely believed to be actively hostile to ambition, difficulty, or anything that seems to demand too much work on their part. So I think this kind of political relationship and commitment from audiences, you know, the danger is that by labelling things slow cinema, or by the whole kind of distribution network not readily enabling these films to be shown, is that actually we're preventing audiences from undergoing this learning experience that we've talked about, which is a learning experience that comes from experience and this direct relationship. And definitely, and it's a shame James Benning isn't here this weekend. He was at the festival last weekend, but he absolutely, you know, I think politics, we've got politics with big P's and little P's all over this, in terms of the mode of production of work, and also, you know, James Benning's films don't overtly have a social context to them. They're depeopled, but, you know, he very much believes that in an hour and a half experience of watching light fade in a forest, that is a deeply political experience that you're having. So absolutely.
And it's political in the sense that there are certain bureaucracies in existence which are very, very committed to stopping people doing other things. So that in Britain, it's long been the case, and I think it's changing now in small ways, but it's long been the case that if you went to, you know, certain commissioning bodies with ideas to make the kind of films we're talking about. I mean, I actually had a meeting with someone who said, look, no, films are about story and they are about character, that's it, and anything else, forget it. And, well, you know, these are... this has certainly for a long time been the politics of filmmaking in Britain and elsewhere, and anyone who can manage to kind of slip through the net in production terms, whether it's by working independently with minimal budgets, or whether it's by kind of making those connections in Rotterdam, for example, and, you know, there is a kind of network that kind of enables you to work in different ways. You know, anyone who can do that. It's again, in a small but important way, it's a kind of dissident act, because there's a great deal of power invested in the ideology of doing it dead straight, according to, you know, and the whole kind of Robert McKee script manual industry.
Yeah. I mean, there's sorry, I keep reading quotes at you, I don't know why. I just wanted to read this quote from Fred because I really, really love it, and it's just such a shame that he's not here, because it's exactly, I mean, he just gets to the crux of just this sort of fear-based culture that we're in. Cinema is like a garden. If all you grew were one kind of flower, it would be very boring, and after a while it would all die and turn into a desert. It's the same with culture. What are we afraid of? So obviously, you know, here he's talking about the importance of diversity, of experience, and actually allowing people, and actually that, you know, really there is nothing to be afraid of in non-narrative kind of action-based films.
I mean, that's for me as well why this debate is also useful to apply to history. You know, for me it's also about reading of history, and, you know, because the cinema, you know, we're told, you know, begun with you know, in 1895 with the first public presentation of Lumiere's brothers. You know, but already to designate cinema as this kind of that wasn't the first projection of a moving image. That was the first projection with an audience, and so cinema is understood as an institution to have existed already with that type of transaction. Whereas actually, I think, you know, there's a broader understanding of what cinema means as a mode of engagement or a mode of practice, you know, that I think extends beyond those parameters and those definitions of origins. And I think, like Lav says, you know, cinema is a young art. You know, it's kind of insane that people are so sure about what it is, you know, after such a short space of time.
So in terms of this sort of inherent sort of radicalism we're talking about in terms of production and presentation and definitions and criticism, and what we're really talking about is actually the state of cinema and world cinema today, as opposed to any particular subcategory of slowness. I guess I was interested in all of your areas of work. Do you see yourself as kind of active agents for change within this as well? I'm just looking at Matthew because you're in front of me there. No, in terms of sort of, you know, what you hope in terms of your PhD, and then how you will go on sort of advocating. Or maybe not. I just
not really much point commenting on that one, but one of the political aspect of this, one way of looking at it that I quite like is the idea that there is an element or a potential in slowness to be radical in a different way to this, in the sense that, like, one of the things that slowness is for kind of producing and enabling people to be with and think through a different sense of time than we are obviously used to, or that is in a way enforced upon us within our everyday life. And one of the way that slow cinema does this is through duration, by and this goes right back to Warhol. This is like Warhol's genius, in that Warhol structural cinema is about producing these kind of huge sort of excesses of time which cannot be commodified in any way whatsoever, like producing images that are purely temporal, that cannot be sold, say, in ways that his Warhol's other visual art, like his screen prints or so on, could actually be commodified, and they could enter a marketplace and even create a marketplace or so on. But his film work is obviously in terms of its popularity and so on, it's minimal, it's minor in comparison to his other kind of visual art, nowadays. And there is a reason for that, because there is a huge kind of implicit challenge in the temporal nature of his film work to, what we have become used to in sort of, forms of capitalism which were emergent in the late 60s and the 70s, that evolved into neoliberalism and then so on. And that you have these kind of, in a way Warhol kind of foresaw the way that time would alter, and that we would enter into kind of new cultures of circulation that would require quite a radical resistance from time-based media, time-based art. And so by producing these sort of excessive durations, slow cinema is able to kind of rupture the sense of time that is enforced on us by neoliberalism, by a kind of accelerationist form of capitalism that we're very used to, whether we're entirely cognizant, conscious of it in everyday terms. And that's a major potential for slow cinema. And like certain artists, Lav does the whole works, and you find these durations in his films, but you find a very direct political engagement with the history of all sort of cultural history and so on. But it is a potential that is there. So it's not to say that like slow cinema is inherently radical. That's a kind of very broad way of looking at it and thinking that it really does have quite radical potential. It could be used in that way. Yeah.
I guess I might be interested to talk to Lav about, because you talked about neoliberalism and the market. I guess I was interested in asking Lav about your relationship with the film market and production, and kind of where your support comes from, and where you see the legacy of your work in terms of archive and all that stuff.
I make cinema, I don't even think about the market, because there's no market for my cinema. It's not a commodity, it's something that I share with people. For practitioners like us, Ben, all the serious filmmakers out there, it's more of a responsibility for us, to the medium, to cinema as art, to cinema as a medium, to communicate and share our experiences, whether it's political or personal. Yeah.
Is that the same for you, Ben? You're nodding away there.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. And yeah, political, personal, I mean, they tend to go hand in hand anyway. I mean, even we have our politics, and even if you're making a film that doesn't have some kind of outright political agenda, I think the politics is still very much in there in the kinds of films that we're kind of talking about. I mean, to me, it seems like it's it's kind of obvious, which is why I don't really like. I mean, I never really like to talk about the politics of my films because I think if you start doing that, then I worry about kind of moving into like being kind of dogmatic or something, or trying to say that one way is better than another way. I think it's important that that there's a kind of ambiguity there. It goes back to what I was saying about there being an openness for an audience. I think it's more important for people like these to talk about the politics, the direct politics of the film. I mean, some filmmakers want to talk about it, but I don't. But it's kind of obvious that if I'm making a film on very kind of meager means, without the normal apparatus that goes into making movies, we do things, small groups, friends, without the need for vast amounts of money. We take time. It becomes like part of our lives. It's not like you take out 6 weeks for your production schedule, which is the way industrial films are made. It's like you have to. It becomes part of your life. It's not like I make films and then I live my life. They're completely intertwined.
Even your kitchen.
Even in my kitchen.
Filmmaking process. Since he actually develops in his kitchen sink, literally.
The process alone, the methodology becomes an ideology. It's a way of life. You work on it for like 9 months, 2 years, and
Yeah.
that's politics itself. The process, the methodology, the commitment to do it.
Yeah.
Right.
I mean, this is the thing that's just staggering for me in terms of the commitment and networks and investment that artists are putting into work, and that's why I guess I keep going back to the debate of how can the work be seen, and is the work seen, and what are the best conditions for showing it, which I guess is the point of showing the work during this festival.
Yeah, I mean,
as
this is a great kind of context. That's why I've really tried to keep like showing work in the art world as well as the cinema world going purely as a because there aren't that many choices, and when you make stuff, you want to share it, you want to get it out there, and that the kind of films that we're making, they're not going to be reaching the multiplexes, so you find any means possible to, but then I also think that this collective experience of being in a cinema, I mean, there's really nothing like it. And I tried to recreate that in the gallery, but I think, like, you could watch Lav's films on DVD at home, but, there's nothing like sharing that space with a bunch of strangers and kind of being kind of forced to sit and watch the whole thing, like you said, like, absolute concentration, and I wish people would turn off their phones. I'm really happy with people sleeping in films. I think it's really like, because you're kind of still immersed in the film. You're kind of in it. But if you start like looking at your iPhone, you're totally detached. You're leaving the space completely, and it's part of the culture that we live in. It's very detached. It's like there's always got to be like more than one thing happening at the same time. But yeah, sleep this weekend. It's fine.
Well, I think you said yesterday that Fred.
Fred Kellerman
was
said to
happy
me
with
once, yes, even I fall asleep in my films. I guess I'm an advocate for slow criticism because I think there's something about the immediacy of response now which is really dangerous, and sometimes kind of listening to music online, and I don't know what you call that thing, but when you've got a bar running under the piece and actually people's tweets jump in. And I listened to a piece by, I think it was like sort of the first thing that Brian Eno had recorded for 10 years or something like that, and then it kind of, someone jumped in 10 seconds and said, "This is brilliant." And I thought, it took him 10 years to record, give it more than 10 minutes. But I realise in this sense I'm maybe more kind of politically compromised than anyone at this table, in the sense that I write in certain contexts. I write for The Independent on Sunday, which is a Sunday newspaper which is fairly mainstream, so I have to engage with the fact that my viewers, my readers, might be more naturally inclined to mainstream cinema, and I, more often than not, will want to nudge them in the direction of, for example, next week, Nuri Bilge Ceylan. But I don't always want to be writing about any of those films. I write also for Sight and Sound, which I suppose is in some ways compromised in that it's an institutional journal. It's published by the British Film Institute. I also write during festivals, I'll write for Screen International, which is a trade journal. And in Cannes and Berlin, it comes out daily. And you have to cover the films daily, and I might review 2 films a day, and often you'll see a competition film, and you'll have to file an immediate response within maybe an hour, and form a snap judgment, which kind of then stands because it's going to end up somewhere on a printout in a festival, and one of the problems is how do you give these films time, and how do you go back, and how do you think again about them? And so occasionally I like, when possible, to go back and write about things that didn't come out. They're not coming out next month or next week or last week. But it's important, for example, for me to write about. I just wrote a career-length piece on the Dardenne brothers, which involved going back and watching all the films again, and some of the early ones I hadn't seen before. And for me, it's only now, when they're, sort of 15 years or whatever after their first fiction feature, now I'm kind of beginning to see what they're doing and what it's about, and, how they've evolved. It's great for me this weekend to go back and see these Fred Kellerman films, something like 15 years after I first started seeing them. But of course, writing about films professionally, you're always supposed to be writing about the thing you saw this morning. Sight and Sound, for example, always covers the things in the month they come out, and often a lot of films won't get written about because, it doesn't look very interesting. I mean, I don't think they ran a piece on the King's Speech, say, because, why would the King's Speech be interesting to Sight and Sound readers? But it's when it becomes, an international phenomenon, it's 2 months later that the film comes to mean something that it didn't originally mean. It acquires a different cultural and political meaning. That's when it's interesting to go back. And actually, one of the really interesting things that Cahiers du Cinema has been doing lately is, for example, for about 3 months after the release of Avatar, they kept going back and saying, what does this film mean? What has it come to mean? How has it kind of embedded itself in the cultural landscape? And to have, Slavoj Žižek or whoever talking about it 3 months after its release, that's a very good way to kind of break us out of this kind of endless PR and release cycle, because otherwise all you're doing is kind of feeding the kind of addiction to novelty, which is actually a very exciting addiction. You go to a festival and, what are the hot new 20 films in competition in Cannes? You want to know before anyone else does. But on the other hand, you have to face the fact that you're just feeding your own addiction, and through doing that, you're kind of feeding everyone else's addiction, and you're helping, the film industry, whether it's Hollywood or whether it's the international festival circuit, it's helping them in their business, which is kind of providing you the constant fix of novelty.
Which I guess is why I was interested in the responsibility of critics like yourself and programmers like George to just cause a rupture within that.
I mean, I think one of the interesting sort of subtext to the debate around slow cinema is it's also that it's hand in hand with kind of historical reevaluation. And I think really the kind of the agent of that has been really the internet. That's kind of created different networks for kind of cinephilia to kind of exist and to exchange material. I mean, I first got involved in film programming to see work, like, because there's certain. I mean, this is only 10 years ago, but and everything's changed so much just in that span. But to see the work of Hungarian director Miklos Jancsó, it's like the only way you could see that work was to organise a season of those films. And he was someone who was becoming, kind of, people were talking about when Bellatar was kind of emerging internationally, very prominently around like a turn of millennium. And then everyone talked about Miklos Jancsó, but no one had seen those films. And so to organise a screening was the only way I could understand of actually seeing that work. Whereas now that's kind of changed so much. And film, like, one of the sort of key texts, historical texts is Chantal Akerman's Jan Dielman, which was one of the, this notoriously long film, that marked all these like critics who saw it in Cannes in the mid-70s, and then periodic sort of screenings. But now it's been released by Criterion, and so there's a whole other generation. So that work that was one of the kind of most famous sort of inaccessible works, there's kind of different degree of accessibility, and so I think we're seeing like this slow, knock-on effect of kind of scholarship, or the way that history of cinema can be read, is also, I think, it's tied in with the type of networks that are enabled by the internet and different modes for films that can circulate.
Which is really important, but obviously we need to be sympathetic and responsive to the fact that not all filmmakers want their work shown on the internet or on DVD, which I guess was almost one of the, not the main reason, but was one of the thinkings behind showing Fred Kellerman's films here, because it wasn't in your packs, but on Fred's website he wrote a great article for The Guardian, I think in 1999, where he basically, criticised DVD culture, and he only wants his work seen on 35 and 16mm prints, which aren't readily in distribution at all. We had to hunt for them.
And it's not a kind of rarefied thing at all. There is something very kind of concrete about the mystique of the crackly, scratched 16mm print, because actually you feel it's like when you go to a library and you take out a book which has been borrowed hundreds of times before, or is sitting in like the reserve of the library, and you can't normally get to it, and you get the jottings in the margin. I mean, there's something about the sort of the physical object of a film. And actually, I mean, this is why it's very disappointing. I just saw I hadn't seen 2 Years at Sea on the big screen before, and when I did, I was really disappointed to see that it was a digital projection, because I know that you're waiting for that 35 print to arrive, and I can't wait to sort of see it with the crackle.
Yeah, well, we were hoping it was going to be ready for this, but...
There's a whole slow story there.
Yes, that's a really slow and upsetting story, but it's getting there. But it's just another one of those trials that you have to get through as a filmmaker. But yeah, I mean, I haven't seen it yet. I don't want to watch the digital version.
No,
so I'm still waiting to watch it.
Kind of crackle to it anyway.
Yeah, I mean, it's got better, that way of showing things, digital projection, but still, it's not got the same object feel that showing on film has. It's too kind of clean and constantly bright. But anyway, that's not that interesting.
We talked about that a little bit yesterday with Lav in terms of materials, and obviously it was, if I'm correct, it's more important for you to actually make the work as opposed to the rarefied nature of the print. So actually most of your work is digital, because that's actually the mode of production in which you operate with to make your work. So it's just different for different filmmakers across the festival.
Yeah, you just have to embrace all these new technologies. It's hard to be, we debated on that before. I mean, during the advent of digital, the issue of being the pure cinema thing. Everything is cinema now. But of course, when you see the works, with all these DCPs now and all the other projectors, you kind of surprise yourself sometimes that, oh, it's a new film, because it's a different look. Every time you go to a festival, what are you using? What kind of projector? Well, may I see, it's a different film. So you just have to embrace all these things as cinema. You cannot be the purist or what,
I mean, and that's one of the striking things with your
Mm.
body of work. You know, when you look at sort of legacies of these like long works, there'd always be like the one, you know, filmmaker would make the one like exceptional instance where they
Mm.
managed to make the long work. Whereas what's, you know, looking at your work from Batang West Side, I
Yeah.
mean, you managed to that duration is not a novelty. It's not a stunt. You know,
Yeah.
it's been part of a process, and it's something that you can work on, and
Yeah.
you handle that space and duration in very different ways.
Mm-hmm.
In
It was
those films.
produced by the studio. It's 35 millimeter. But I was able to, have it in the 5 hours. And,
Yeah.
Now it's a lost film because the producer is hiding it. So.
This kind of Lav's kind of break with the sort of studio structure in the Philippines, where he made his
Mm.
first films. This film Batang West Side, that
It's 5 hours. Yeah.
5 hours long, and he was just telling us about how they've the producer has refused to screen the print, but Lav was involved in a covert operation to to steal the negative.
Yeah, we stole the negatives and then do not write about this, do not talk about this. we stole the negative masters, and then the Vienna Film Museum took it and they're keeping it. They printed 2 works, and we're waiting for the producers to die. So we can show them.
They have a way of living a very long time. They're hard to kill.
The Vienna Film Museum, they're heroes of cinema.
Yeah, I mean they're currently
Yeah.
undergoing.
Yeah.
They're making lots of new 35mm prints of Benning's
Yeah.
films as well at the moment. So, in terms of just making sure that some of this work lasts and is actually on film, they're doing an incredible job, I think.
Yeah.
We've got probably about kind of 15 minutes or so left, so we can carry on talking. But I wondered at this stage if there were any questions from the audience about some of the ideas we've already talked about. Yeah.
I was quite surprised to hear in your initial introduction that slow film did not include narrative. This was later backed up by sort of allowing a little bit of narrative by perhaps by saying it was undramatic. It was undramatic narrative that you didn't allow. And then we had, and these two do join together, and then we had this interesting discussion about what I think is a wonderful image, because I've never come across it before. I think these 3 people walking out to the horizon and coming back again. And obviously, it's a cliche to, you people who work in the industry of slow film, but it's not a cliche to me because I've never seen it before. And it also seems to be highly charged with narrative. Could you sort of clear me up on this idea of slow film and narrative and whether it's allowed or not?
I wanted to, actually, this was a point I wanted to take issue with also, because, a lot of these films could be regarded as undramatic narrative, and they're undramatic in the conventional sense, but certainly the 2 Fred Kellerman films we saw yesterday, they're incredibly dramatic, and, Fate is, one dramatic event after another, murder, rape, drunkenness. It's very full on. Frost is slow burning, but every scene kind of it is a different crisis in a way. Bela Tarr's films, intensely narrative and intensely dramatic. The narrative takes a long time to unfold, a very long time in some cases. But if you look at either Werkmaster Harmonies or Satan Tango, they are operas. They could be operas. They would be very long operas. But you could do them as operas because they have that incredible. They're Shakespearean in their intensity and narrative. Another, remarkably long, remarkably slow film, Jacques Rivette's Out One, made in mid to late 70s,
Early 70s.
Early 70s, never remember the exact date, but it's about 30 and a half hours long, and it's a whole kind of it's a long, very complex thriller-like novel, really. It's or a cross with a soap opera. And it actually, you know, it really draws on the incredibly long serials of 19th century French fiction. So the idea that these are undramatic narratives, well, you know, some of these films are, and in some cases the narrative is pared down. But I certainly wouldn't regard that as a criterion. I wouldn't say these are all about undramatic narrative, but I would certainly say that they're, let's say that one way or another, they are always dramatic in a sense that would completely confound the adherents of those Robert McKee screenwriting manuals. In terms of, you know, the people walking into the horizon, walking back again, I think actually if I had seen that Albert Serra film first, I like that moment, but it's kind of an extreme case. If I'd seen that before anything else, I wouldn't have had any doubts about it at all. I think it had been spoiled for me by the fact that a couple of years previously I'd seen the instantly notorious Vincent Gallo film The Brown Bunny, which was screened in Cannes, and, you know, to an audience of critics who are likely to take this kind of thing very seriously indeed. And there's a scene in which he drives off on his motorbike into the salt plain desert, and there's a pause, and he drives all the way back, at which point all the audience, and it's very hardened, you know, kind of art attuned critics, started sort of whooping and shrieking, and I even heard the odd yeehaw. And I think that was the moment at which it kind of became apparent that, you know, we would be seeing this going off, coming back thing, you know, a few times over the next few years, as has been the case. I think Albert Serra and Bela Tarr have done it best, but, you know, don't be surprised if you see it again a few times in the years to come.
Try it.
You should. Oh, you do, but your guy sort of floats off to the edge of the lake.
And then floats
And then
back
he
in.
floats back in. And it's a very beautiful contemplative moment.
I find it very tense. But it's to me that's full of narrative, that scene and various other scenes or individual shots. I don't think of it as a non-narrative film, nor a lot of other, like Lissandro's films. They're not non-narrative, but like you say, they're pared down. It's maybe more like about plot. You know, plot and narrative get kind of mixed in together, but they're actually really different. I mean, they're maybe like, they're not plot-based films, and they're not like 3-act, you know, arc type things.
Yeah,
but
an exposition.
Right, but but there's plenty of narrative going on. I mean, you know, you stick a guy in a boat, and there's a story. I mean, it's.
I mean, yeah, in your films, Lav, I mean...
There's a narrative in the rustling of the leaves alone, so, yeah. You just watch it for like 10 minutes, the tree is moving, there's a narrative there. There's poetry there.
Yeah, it's interesting, there's like, I always think one of my... I mean, even, you know, in the most extreme kind of avant-garde film, you know, there is a very close proximity between sort of infuriation and excitement, I think. One of my favourite sort of minimalist films, this film by Richard Serra, that's a Colourfield film, where he mounts the camera above a pile of coloured sheets of paper, and so the screen is just filled with the colour of each sheet of paper, that's then interrupted as his hand comes in and moves the sheet, and then you get onto the next sheet, and it's about a 40-minute film as it goes through the entire stack. And the most dramatic moment in the film that has these like incredible reactions is where the hand comes in and changes the paper, but rather than going from a red sheet to a yellow sheet, it goes from a black sheet to another black sheet. And is this like in the audience, you know, people are like going crazy because they're like waiting for these dramatic interventions. And then it's suddenly the dramatic interventions and it's the same colour, and people are like completely freaking out.
No, but for me that's one of the magics of kind of, you know, minimalist film. Like, for me, I always have it with James Benning's films as well. So, you know, 13 Lakes is 10 fixed shots of 13 of the great American lakes. For a lot of them, it is just a single shot. You can hear this amazing soundtrack, but there's no action. And I think probably on about the 6th or the 7th lake, a speedboat just goes
Oh, yeah.
straight through the whole horizon, and it's just like the entire world has erupted. Like just that slight intervention into this minimal landscape just makes you rethink everything. It's just such a radical, richly narrative or plot-based intervention.
And it's funny what the whole argument about whether films contain details or not, or whether a lack of detail is kind of conducive to writing or not. I mean, I tend to write obsessively. I take notes in films, but I don't think I've ever taken so many notes. I mean, 18 solid sides of notes watching this Sharon Lockhart film, Double Tide, which is simply about. I mean, it's not what it's about. I mean, you couldn't write any more than maybe sort of a one-line synopsis for Sight and Sound. But it's about a woman picking cockles on a beach or clams on a beach, and it's 2 takes, and the whole thing lasts 2 continuous takes, lasting nearly 2 hours, I think,
Yeah.
an hour and a half. And it's a diptych, and the 2 halves are, to all intents and purposes, pretty much the same. But you become aware of people coming and going in the background. You become aware of sort of shifts of light, of the sky. The most minute things become events. And one of the things about the kind of cinema we're talking about is they change our habits in how you classify events. And sometimes you're not even sure whether something really is an event or not. But it becomes about something other than he does this, she does this. The US cavalry come to the rescue.
But did you spot James introduced the film? I don't know whether anybody saw Double Tide last weekend, and James Benning introduced it, and I hadn't noticed this in it, but did you notice when she started picking with her right hand, not her left hand? If not, you need to watch the film again. She's actually a painter, so she didn't want to collect the clams with her right hand in case she injured the hand, so she was collecting with her left hand, and then halfway through the film she injures that hand and starts picking them up with her right hand.
I'm sure I did notice, but I'll have to check my 18 sides. If I did, it's in there.
But James very much was kind of like, again, it's this moment within the event where the whole world just starts to transform and change your understanding, which I find really, really exciting about this form of cinema. I mean, I guess one of the things that I was going to mention as well, which we've not talked about in terms of narrative, is a lot of the time slow cinema is considered as having an emotional detachment as well, which for me I find very confusing, because I mean Fate and Frost last night was, the boy in Frost wasn't constantly saying I'm happy, I'm unhappy now, but the emotional intensity in that film was incredibly powerful. So
and actually these things, there is such a thing as slow comedy as well, and Albert Serra, I mean certainly a Birdsong, I would file along Buster Keaton in a way, in the same way that João César Monteiro, an extraordinary Portuguese filmmaker whose films are all kind of self-portraits from the point of view of, I think probably a very disturbed man, but a man who kind of was able to turn his disturbance into a dangerous pervert, totally. And you probably would not want to spend any time with him, but he managed to turn his strangeness and his perversion into art of a very slow burning but very funny kind. And in one of his films, there's a sequence which is kind of traditional slapstick taken to a sort of a hyper rarefied level where this guy who is in this particular film, he was probably in his 60s and looked about 3 times that age, is having a dalliance with possibly a 16-year-old girl, I suspect younger, and her angry father turns up and is going to kill him, and he very coolly lights a cigarette, and the father knocks it out of his hand. And he lights another cigarette, and the father knocks it out of it. And this goes on and on and on. As I remember, it goes on and on for about 10 minutes. And it's like a kind of performance art take on, one of those Laurel and Hardy routines where they're kind of winding up the man with the big moustache and, they're sort of slowly smashing up each other's cars. But that's where it comes from. And it's very funny. But it's very funny in a kind of regular way. It keeps on being funny in exactly the same way. And it goes on in exactly the same way. And as it builds up, it becomes like a kind of slapstick version of a Steve Reich or Terry Riley piece, you know.
Alessandro.
Just a question, really. I was thinking about when you were talking about the kind of idea of the politics within the work, and I just feel that there's also the kind of investment that the filmmakers are making towards community, and sort of like kind of a long-term immersion and documentation, which has a really a connection back to sort of maybe a kind of a process of field work or a sort of more ethnographic. And I know that there is, I mean, that's maybe a different style of filmmaking to the documentary, but I think that kind of sense of commitment is connected really to the ethnographic film making processes that, you know, you can also see as an important thing that developed as part of, say, anthropological filmmaking.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing, you know, and Third Cinema came out of, you know, the founding, like, essay of Third Cinema is related to the idea of documentary and film essay, but maybe it'd be interesting, Lav, because Lav's worked all across the Philippines, which in itself is an incredibly sort of distributed country made out of thousands of islands. But I wonder maybe that idea of community and your crew, is that important in your...
Oh, yeah, of course. Yeah. But you're talking about the politics in the film, how we represent it based on our culture, yeah?
Yeah, I mean...
My films are very much about the Filipino struggle. Evolution of Filipino families, about the 17 years of martial law, the dictatorship of Marcos, where we struggled so hard. And then this film that's going to be shown, Melancholia, is about the revolution of the left in the country, the Communist Party of the Philippines, where it actually failed, but the revolution is still going on. And I'm doing this discourse on people who are still believing that the revolution can be can be as successful. Yeah, so all my works represent the struggle of my people historically. There's a lot of historical perspective in my works. Even if you see these individual characters there, it's all about that. Yeah, the ethnographic thing, the representation of a certain culture. Yeah.
I think it's just interesting, really, to make that connection to the idea of people working, and the idea that breaking up that habits of viewing, that actually the filmmakers went out and documented people doing different types of everyday things and finding pleasure in the community that was there, and it's allowing kind of other filmmakers to do different things, but I think it's part of that.
I think a great example of that is the Portuguese filmmaker Pedro Costa, who for years has been making films very specifically about the poorer quarters of Lisbon and areas that are being torn down, and I mean really quite extreme poverty in Lisbon, and particularly within the Cape Verde immigrant community. And it's very much kind of community work that he works with people again and again and again, and you really do get a sense that it's very much about providing a kind of mediation to get their voice and their identity on screen. I mean, another reason that these films are political as well, and this is not sort of purely true of slow cinema, but certainly all art cinema, real art cinema, and cinema of the sort we're talking about today in any case, is we tend to think of this being a somehow rarefied, pure cinema in some sense, but it's absolutely not that, because, if there's any kind of pure cinema, it's the kind of mainstream cinema which says, this is only a movie, and all you need to know about is the codes of science fiction, all you need to know about is the codes of the thriller, because it doesn't really exist outside this movie theatre. And actually all the films we're talking about today, they're the work of people who go out into the world and actually look at the world and things that can be represented but somehow lie beyond cinema. They lie in the field of reality, and they're to do with different cultural habits, so they can be as much about painting, or I'm thinking, for example, a filmmaker that we haven't talked about today, but he's made some of the great slow burning films. Manuel de Oliveira, who's still working at 104. But actually, his films don't make sense purely viewed as cinema, because unless you're willing to kind of make the leap and sort of think about, at least, be aware that his main reference points are not so much from cinema, but from literature and even from theology. Part of the bargain you make when you come and see films like this is you say, well, I'm going to the cinema, but I'm going somewhere else as well. I'm going to a different cultural field as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's often referred to as kind of non-professional actors, which I really hate that term, but it is, like Costa's incredible ability to sort of gain the trust, again, that's the wrong word, with the people living in the housing complex that was being destroyed in Lisbon is extraordinary across that trilogy, which is showing later in the festival, but I definitely recommend seeing Costa's films. Carol?
Time for one more. Just to say thank you, it's really amazing. I hadn't expected to come, so it's been a real bonus. Coming up for me is, not quite sure how to put it, maybe it's not even a question, but perhaps in this kind of being in a film where duration is really, really key, do people think about, either audience or the filmmakers, about how time actually is just only in the present now? And, from that kind of, you mentioned theology, I mean, I'm not thinking theology, but that sense of the essence of time is only now, and so the future and the past have gone, or are illusionary. Is that something people think about when they're making slow film or durational film? The concept of time as only actually being now, experienced only now. And does an audience, do I feel that when I'm in that kind of film? And as my experience really close, I am actually the screen, not the observer in the sense it's that close.
I mean, definitely, for me personally, I'm just speaking personally, I really love watching these types of films or particular directors, because it does enable me to genuinely be in the moment and just be kind of focused on that work. And I know James sort of talked last week when he introduced his film that somebody asked him about his experiences viewing his own film, and he was, he sort of said, well, as a person, I suffer from, anxiety. I'm quite an anxious person. So for me, actually, I make this work in order to actually be in the moment. And we're not talking about any kind of Zen Buddhism or particular things like that. But yeah, I think it. I think it's there.
But
Bergson, I mean, I was that's something that came up in the symposium that was on last week, and I talked about a lot philosophically maybe, that Bergson would be really the philosopher of duration, who has become very important for a lot of people. And there's a huge body of work on the event, the concept of the event, coming from philosophy as it engages with cinema. But so there is a large engagement between philosophy and thinking about duration.
Yeah, it's been really nice for me to sort of, I'm very much sort of at the moment caught up with this kind of non-dual thing, and so to see that there are conversations going on in other aspects of life as well is great. It makes me feel connected.
I think with these films you're very intensely in the present, but at the same time, I think they also kind of really allow you to retain the past. You retain what you've seen, or you become aware of its having passed. I mean, if you go and see Transformers 3, I defy you to remember what happened a minute ago. But I mean, I remember there was a point last night watching Frost and thinking, God, it seems like a very long time since they were on that point of the journey at which, they were sitting in that bar, and then the moment at which the car drew up alongside them and they went to the woman's house. This all seemed like a terribly long time, and I felt I had been on the journey with them, and I was remembering different points of the journey. And there's an extraordinary thing, I don't know if you've seen the Raul Ruiz film, The Mysteries of Lisbon, but there's an extraordinary moment at the end. It's about, 7 hours or something, or less, but it's based on this long cycle of 19th century novels, and it ends with the protagonist kind of remembering everything that's gone before, or possibly imagining it about to happen in the future. But certainly there comes a point at the end of the film at which everything you've seen, there's a sort of reflux. It all kind of comes back on you. It's like when you get to the end of Proust, it's like the novel is all still there. You're reading kind of the last full stop of the book. but at the same time, everything you've read is there. And the thing about duration and the alleged difficulty of some of these films. I mean, I think there's a fantastic illustration of it in the last 8 minutes of 2 Years at Sea, which is just. I don't want to spoil this, but it's an 8-minute shot or an 8-minute close-up of the subject of the film sitting in front of a fire. And in real life, in daily life, you'd never think there was any problem with sitting, in front of a fire with someone for 8 minutes just gazing at them. You wouldn't think twice about them. It seems in a film, it seems an extraordinary thing, but actually, I think Ben's film is there to prove that it should be no more extraordinary in a film than in life, and they're just as illuminating.
Thanks.
Did anybody else want to answer Carol's question?
Yeah, I mean that's one of the things I found. I mean, and it's also it's very relative. So 8 hours, so like watching the Kelman film last night, I was like, oh, only 3 hours. It felt like it's like a breeze, But even 8 hours, I mean, like in any, as soon as you look at relative, 8 hours is actually not long, I mean, that's actually very tiny, and in terms of representation, this idea of like real time or something, I mean, you get such a fragment, and I think Lav's films are they're incredibly elliptical films, and they cover time and treat this idea of the present and the idea of memory and kind of internal memory within their own structures in very intricate and complex ways, creating kind of echoes and absences and gaps within them that I think, as a spectator, I think it's really kind of incredible and quite unique experience, when you spend that type of time with certain characters, that you build a kind of different type of relationship, and also then the film begins to build its own memory and kind of architecture that you then kind of find yourself kind of occupying within. It starts to build its own past and own future.
And it's all absolutely relative. I mean, there are some recent Woody Allen films which clock in at a sort of perfect 90 minutes, and it's kind of gag after gag after gag, and event after event after event, and it's purgatory. It's just and you're looking at oh my God, it's only been on 10 minutes, and you've got another 80 to go. It's hell.
Any more questions? No. Are there any more reflections and things that people have been wanting to say and haven't had the opportunity yet?
I think what I'd like to propose now is that we sit here for the next 20 minutes just all stroking our chin in silence. And I think
that would be too much of a cage prestige.
Immersion. Let's go immersion. Yeah, looking at Frost last night, it was like, it's a very short film. The scene where they were like hanging out in a bar before the rape happened. You see these Russian refugees. Just looking at them, you see this whole history of displacement. Yeah. So it's a long film, actually. It's a short film, but it's a long film. Yeah, immersion.
Yeah, I think in a way, Lav's work is particularly significant because it's the way it deals with present, past, and then potential future narratives is very, very complex in a way to kind of think through how we might represent time, not in a way that is kind of overtly present. Because bringing up Bergson before, I mean, Lav just said earlier that in his films, the concept of time is spatial, and like Bergson's theory kind of rests on the fact that like usually the way we conceptualize matter and the world, we see things around us, and we think through that stuff in terms of space. And the way Bergson looks at it is that all of that stuff is in fact temporal. So matter is constructed somehow, produced by time. So oscillations and productions of time. And it is a problem to when you have, like, again, very time-based media, like durational stuff, to get away from that kind of material presentness of time, and to think about past and the reverberations of past and presents and futures, because in itself, like if you follow the Bergsonian line, duration is materially present, and that's what you feel when you watch these films, like Tarkovsky's time pressure and stuff like that. You feel the kind of material presentness of this duration, and it's very difficult to to introduce past and futures into that dynamic in a particularly complex way, as certain filmmakers do.
I mean, to me, the point that came up a lot is this idea of the trajectory that certain filmmakers use. It's almost like a theorem that has to be worked out by each filmmaker. It's quite a Proustian, but a Bergsonian one as well, that it's an exploration of that particular theorem of how time and space relate to each other. So I see it as a kind of coda that each director has to take on in some form and explore in their own way, because the relationship between spatiality and temporality is quite a complex one and shifts quite a lot. So to me it seems almost like a theorem, really, that different directors have to investigate in some way. It's a ritualistic process of sorts.
Does anybody have any other final comments? If it's wrong talking about final comments, really, we could, if we remembered how we started, we could actually repeat that, just like we saw. That was one of the strategies that Kellerman used in Frost last night, with the dialogue in the beginning being echoed at the end, which gives you this sense of everything being full circle, or everything just patterns repeating and things being infinite. So yeah, the whole festival's just completely messing with everybody's concepts of time. Have no sense of what time it is, but the mobile phone is telling me that it's 12:47. I think I'm so excited to be able to see these films over the next few days, and also films throughout the whole festival month. So some of the works that have been mentioned in the panel, Albert Serra's Honour of the Nights is showing in a couple of weeks. Pedro Costa's film, Colossal Youth, is showing. But you've all got the brochure, so I just urge you to kind of go on the journey across the month. And for those of you just here this weekend, I'm just really excited that we can all be warriors together now. And absolutely, if you've not, I absolutely urge people to take the kind of the leap of faith, or to discipline, or whatever term we want to call it, but to be warriors with Lav's film tomorrow, Melancholia, and Century of Birthing on Sunday. And really hope to see you all there. And thanks a lot to all of the artists.